Good evening, everyone. Welcome along to next RPS Scotland talk. My name's Dave Ferguson. I'm the regional organiser for RPS Scotland. It's nice to see so many faces here tonight on what is quite a dreich night outside, I think, for probably the majority of us. If you're in somewhere nice and exotic, then we're very jealous. But you're very welcome along to our talk here this evening. And it's a great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Alex Neil, FRPS, who's going to be talking about photographing the Great Wilderness. The talk is going to be 90 minutes long. There'll be two 45 minutes talks with a break in between for everyone to get and stretch the legs and fill their glasses or their cups with tea, coffee, whatever they prefer to do. As I say, it's a great pleasure to introduce Alex. In the far northwest of Scotland, between Torridon and Ullapool, is one of the UK's most remote and dramatic mountain landscapes, the Great Wilderness. Over the past 4 years, landscape photographer Alex Neil has extensively photographed this little known area, culminating in his new book of the same name. Photographing the areas required a committed approach. During the project, he has backpacked for hundreds of miles and spent dozens of nights camped in remote glens and on high mountain summits. And Alex is going to tell us about his book, tell us about all the photographs he's taken. I'm sure he'll mention some of his workshops that he runs as well. He's more than welcome to do that as well. Bit of self-promotion, Alex, if you want to let us know about your workshops that you run for the members as well.
Like my second slide, actually. So yeah, hot
well,
on
that's
that.
good. That's good timing then. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all along. We will have question and answer at the end. What we would ask you to do, if you do have any questions, if you can put them in the question and answer chat box, and Stephen, our Scotland Secretary, will field the questions and be asking the questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Alex.
Right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I'll just start sharing my screen, actually. And I guess you guys probably know your way around Zoom by now, but you should be able to fiddle around if you're seeing other people's pictures on screen, which I certainly am.
And we are seeing your presentation fine, though. So.
Yeah, great. Okay. How do I hide that? It doesn't really matter. Okay, yeah, well, thank you everybody for joining to me talk about the Great Wilderness, my big project that I've been working on for the last 4 years, which is now culminated in this book. This is me in the Great Wilderness. This is what I look like in my adventure form, I guess. This is in December of last year, and I'm going to talk about this trip a little bit later on. But I do guide people professionally. I lead workshops, but they're sufficiently adventurous that a big part of my job is actually as a hiking guide, effectively. Although in the winter, I hire a winter mountain leader who you can see at the bottom left of the screen there, because you can't really teach photography and keep an eye on safety in the winter. It's a bit too much, but I do take groups out internationally as well. This is Iceland in the Southern Highlands. And my second favourite place after the Northwest Highlands, the Drakensberg, a really spectacular 3,000-metre mountain escarpment that borders Lesotho and South Africa. So that's an amazing place to hike as well. But my favourite place is the Northwest Highlands, largely because I see it as home. Whether you Scots see me as one of your countrymen or not, I don't know. But I certainly see it that way. And I absolutely love hiking in these mountains. I've pretty much hiked up all of them now in the Torridonian Sandstone area in the Northwest Highlands. But I did release a book in 2015 called Northwest, which covered the whole area of mountains that is Torridonian Sandstone. And immediately after that, I had an itch to scratch because I hadn't been up Slioch during that project, which I thought was a massive omission, really, but I just didn't have the chance. So the following December, I set off with a couple of friends on this route that you see here, the red dotted line. Up to the top of Slioch, which is a moderately tough hike, but it can be done as a day hike. It's one of the more accessible mountains in the sort of Fisherfield, letter U area that we call the Great Wilderness. And you're going to see these maps quite a lot because I made these myself, so I'm quite proud of them. I'm going to use them a lot. But it's about 7 kilometers to the base of the mountain, and then you basically just start making your way up. And we started. Well, this is the view we were going for. I used Google Earth quite a lot to get a sense of what a summit vista might be like, just so that I can have an idea for how I might arrange mountain peaks, for example. But we set off a little bit later than planned, and that wasn't really too much of a problem because there's no prospect of us getting to the top of Slioch for sunrise. It really is too far to be doing that. And this is looking back to Torridon from the base of Slioch, which we reached just as the sunrise. So this is one of the peaks of Ben A. But we were soon up at the snow line, and this is, I guess, late-ish morning, probably 11 o'clock-ish. And as we got higher, of course, the snow got a bit thicker, but it wasn't too difficult until we got on the plateau when it thickened up a little. But I mean, we were a group of 3, so plenty of time to break trail for each other. And we found some nice sastrugi on the way up, which is something I love to photograph, albeit here I was mostly just focusing on getting the hike complete. But that's looking over to Torridon, and you can see there a cloud bank, which I could see advancing on us, and I was worried was going to we were going to completely lose the sun by the time we reached the summit. I think this is looking across to the Phanex here with Harshan hiking in the snow. I mean, snow is just a wonderful thing to photograph generally, but it is nice for hiking images as well. And this is one of the subsidiary peaks of Slioch from the summit, and you can probably tell from this photo that there's a little bit of sun on the left to the north there, but we have just missed the sunlight really. The cloud bank beat us to the summit of the mountain, and I was pretty crestfallen, to be honest, because I was assuming that we would need sunlight to make a good image. I actually told Harshan to pose on the edge just to get a sort of hiking shot, but as he did that, a gust of wind got going and he kind of panicked, which is when I took this photo. But it was very, very windy up there, quite unpleasantly cold as well, very humid, which can make our winters surprisingly bitter, particularly for people who are used to dry cold, who've come from the Alps or something like that. But this was the scene that I ended up photographing, and it really surprised me in that the fact that it was overcast made it sort of unwelcoming. And I think that was, mirrored in a way by the texture of the snow here in the foreground. Obviously, you sort of have a leading line idea here. And I felt that this worked best in portrait. So this was the photo that I ended up publishing in this book in the end. And inadvertently, I'd taken the first photograph of the project, because at this point, I still intended to photograph, Kintail. That's a little wheel on my mouse that is a little bit too sensitive. But that summer, I went to Kintail, and I found the hiking relatively challenging for the variety of views available, and I realized that it would really be quite difficult going from the northwest to the west. And I had a workshop planned in Fisherfield in May anyway, so I was going back there. And in this little section, I'm going to talk you through photography a little bit. I know you're all photographers, so I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs too much. But I thought I would talk about some of the specific concerns that I have when I'm taking photographs myself. This is the hike that we planned, starting at Pool U on the coast, which is at the North Coast 500. And if that's a triggering term for people, maybe I should say it more. But yeah, generally I will walk in from Pool U out to the causeway. But if the weather's going to be good on the first night, and that's that wheel again, we'll camp on Ben Ari Char, which you see here, which offers a pretty remarkable view into Fisherfield and towards Evasion, this most remote Munro, although plenty of people will argue with you about that. If you're a Munroist, you might have other mountains that you think are more remote. But this is the view in that to me is like a mini Yosemite Valley, quite a unique view in Scotland, and one that I've photographed many times. But this kind of lighting, it's obviously a beautiful summer day here, but it's not the kind of dynamic lighting that I would really be looking for. The following morning, we had a pretty incredible sunrise. I guess all of you get excited if you're landscape photographers when you see a red sky like this. I find these very, very difficult scenes, and I thought I'd just briefly mention why. I actually photographed this as an exposure bracket, and this is the darkest exposure. And if you look at the sky on the left-hand side there, you can see that it's white or yellow. That section of sky was actually bright red, just like everywhere. It shifted to white and bright yellow because the color channels are clipping. So the green and blue channels are clipping. Oh, sorry, the green and red channels are clipping hard, and that gives you yellow or bright yellow or white as the all of the channels become saturated. So it's already inaccurate in that sense in terms of color. And then you have the middle exposure, which lets you see into the shadows a little bit. But I mean, this is nothing like as bright as it looks to your eye. To your eye, it looks something a bit more like this. So you're aware that the landscape is in shadow, and yet everything is really quite clear. And so the trick of image editing, of course, is to find a way of combining these contrasts to somehow simulate what you are seeing. And so you can do that with an HDR file. This is the HDR file, although when you combine these 3 images in Lightroom into an HDR, it just looks like the middle exposure, but it does have all the information of the other files. And you can combine them and lift the shadows and darken the highlights and apply various other adjustments to get something like this. And then I look at this and I think, well, how realistic is this really? Well, I would argue that your eyes will compensate for the blue cast in the shadows there that naturally comes from that blue sky. So you don't see it quite as blue as that. And if you look carefully, you'll see the top of the central mountains there are really quite dark compared to the base of the mountains, and that's due to how the image has been edited. So you could say that that was a halo. So I want to correct both of those things. So with a bit of Photoshop work, I arrive at something like this. But this still really doesn't solve the problem, because ultimately your screen does not shine back at you as bright as the sun. And so there will always be this contrast range limitation, which is, of course, only compounded when you're printing an image. So a very difficult image, that one there. And this is looking south towards Ben Allegan in Torridon. Unfortunately, you can see there's a plantation to the bottom right there that's been completely denuded of trees. So a bit of a scar on the landscape, otherwise quite a nice scene. So that was the first morning, and as far as I was concerned, another shot in the bag for the project, although actually I hadn't decided it was going to be a project quite yet. And we were on to Camp 2 here in this little valley, and that's because the weather forecast was really quite bad, so we had to get some shelter that day. And I thought I would talk a little bit about composition here, not from the perspective of leading lines or diagonals or rule of thirds, because many of you will be familiar with those pretty staid rules that I don't tend to apply myself, even though I learned them when I started out. But I find composition interesting from the perspective of what it can do for an image, and particularly if it has an effect on the storytelling of an image. And I thought these two photos would be good to contrast with one another, because here the story of the image for me is you have this boulder on its own looking out over the view over Fionloch there. Whereas if I take a couple of steps to the left and reframe, this image becomes about the rock as almost like a sculptural piece, this egg shape, this symmetrical shape, which of course I've framed symmetrically to emphasize it. So one thing that I think a lot of people don't really consider when they're composing an image is just what composition can do for the understanding of an image, for its perception. So that wasn't a hugely productive camp there, because the weather really wasn't good. But I'd planned this trip around getting to the top of Evasion on the best weather day, and that is what we did. So we hiked this short distance that you see. I don't know if you can actually see my mouse here, actually, but we hiked a short distance up to Evasion. And this is a little video I recorded talking through my gear, but rather than make you watch a video, I thought I'd very, very briefly talk through this. So on the left there, you can obviously see my tent. This is a 2-man tent. I was lending out my 1-man tents to the clients because this was a trip in the first COVID summer. So we were doing social distancing and hiking. But yeah, I was carrying a 2-man tent as a result. It's about 3.5 kilos. Then I have a very lightweight sleeping kit. This is actually a winter mat, so it's good down to below freezing actually, but a summer bag. And this sleeping kit weighs about 1.5 kilos, as does my backpack, which I've since bought a lighter version of. My camera gear is pretty stripped down actually. I just carry one camera now, although I was carrying 2 cameras for this trip. I carry a Canon R5. Here you can see a 5DSR, but I just take 2 lenses now, a 24 to 105 and a 70 to 200, which pretty much covers me for everything. If I do need to go wider, I will shoot a panorama. If I need to go longer, then I will crop. And you can see next to the camera gear a stove and gas canister. And then various bits and bobs and big battery pack. I'll sometimes watch videos on my phone or read when the weather's bad and I'm tent bound. And then all my clothes and food are there on the right hand side, which is pretty minimal as well. You can't afford to carry loads of sets of spare clothes and so on. And I eat about 900 grams of food a day, something like that. So for a 5-day trip, I'll start out with an extra 5 kilos of food, which means that pretty much every trip I start, I'm over 20 kilos, sometimes 22, 23 when I'm in Scotland, maybe up to 25, 26. If it's winter, I'll take even more food and, of course, all of the winter safety equipment. And then very occasionally, I've done a crazy trip in the Drakensberg or in Greenland once where I've carried 35 kilos. So it can be quite arduous getting to the top of these summits, but I won't complain about that too much because back in the 60s, people were carrying much more. So a bit more on composition. When I was up on Evasion, that was actually my 5th or 6th time up there. I think I've been up there more than 10 times now. And one thing I wanted to do was explore the summit a bit more extensively, and the light wasn't too good. So I actually just went hiking with my phone to try and scramble around some of the rocks and so on. And this is on my way down. And I think this composition actually works moderately well. Obviously, it's a bit wonky because it's just a quick shot, but it balances okay. But I wanted something a little bit simpler. And I thought if I headed down to the left, I could bring the loch more into alignment with Anchellach, which is the mountain there in the background, and the 2 Benjerrigs below it to the left. But as I did, the loch started to dominate the scene, really. So I thought about just using half of it, filling the bottom of the frame with the loch. And I think that this would actually work really well. In fact, the previous image would as well, if you had lovely calm weather and you could reflect the clouds in the water and so on. I think that would be quite effective. But as it was, this doesn't really work either because you end up with just this big dead shape at the bottom of the frame. So I hunted around for foregrounds, and I do have an interest, a vague interest, a very non-specific interest in geology. This is more of a conglomerate type of Torridonian sandstone, which is quite unusual. So this was an interesting thing to photograph. But here I'm actually just taking a record shot just so I have a sense of what's there should I come back. But a moment later, I found a composition that I was really excited about. This sort of coffin-shaped rock is about 8 feet long. And I love how the diagonal lines of it mirror the interlocking diagonals that happen into the distance. So this, for me, is graphically quite a strong image and a composition that I was really excited to return to. But as it was, I actually went up the mountain 5 times subsequently, and I never got the chance to take this photo due to a whole combination of reasons. So unfortunately, it was one that was never quite realized for the project, which is a great frustration of mine because I made it a bit of a line in the sand at one point, but ultimately I couldn't delay forever. So this was the image that I took in the evening, just as I was about to head down to photograph that rock. And of course, if I was down there at this point, or in fact, even here, if I'd had my 5DSR with me, I think I would have made an image I was quite happy with, even in this lighting. But certainly here, I could have taken a nice image. But unfortunately or fortunately, as I started to head down, the clouds started to form around me. So instead, I ran up to the summit, and this was the scene just as I got to the top, just in time. And you can imagine here, you just spray and pray to a certain degree in the hopes that the perfect image will reveal itself. And about 20 frames later, this is the photo that I took with this lovely curl of a bit of mist sort of wrapping itself, framing the loch below. So a really fortuitous moment, and actually the rock that I was showing you there is to the right of the image, in that bit in the cloud. So I really did make the right decision not going down there. And this is the edit. So I showed you quite an extreme example of an edit from Benari Char, which incidentally is the mountain to the top left there, a second ago. But this is more commonly how I will edit things when everything fits together. I never clone things out except for maybe my own shadow. I never remove anything. I never warp anything out of the frame. And I tend to keep my processing as realistic as possible, whilst also trying to keep it quite bright, particularly when I'm printing. And that cloud inversion appeared and then disappeared rather rapidly. And this is the other view looking south towards the hills of Torridon and over the crags of Ben Lair. And I was really excited to photograph this scene. This is polarized actually, which helped to cut through the haze even further. And I like to shoot a scene in a variety of ways so that I have different options to choose from when I'm working on a project, or if a magazine wants a landscape version, I've only got the portrait, of course, then that's kind of frustrating too. So here's 3 different versions. Here I'm cropping out a lock at the bottom of the frame to give the implication that these ridges continue on and on, and I quite like the idea of the mountains just sat on top of other mountains. But zooming in a little bit more here, hang on a second, I just admitted somebody and now I've lost my control. Okay, Shift F5. So zooming in a little bit more, I liked this relationship between the cloud beneath the summit. This is Spidian Corile on Liach, and the 2 summits, higher summits, Ruistac Moor and Sail Liath on Ben A, and they come together to form this amazing combined ridge, or implied combined ridge. But I liked this mirroring between the cloud and this pool on top of Ben Lair. So that was the idea of that image. And then finally the panorama, just to make the most of that incredible alignment of mountains. So 3 different images of a very similar scene there. So then it was from the top of Evasion onto another low camp, our final camp, and the forecast was terrible. I wasn't really expecting to get any more images. But there was some nice rain coming through, and rain is not always an easy thing to photograph. You need the right kind of rain and the right kind of clouds, because of course too often it just appears as a mist effectively, and then you don't have any definition in the clouds either. But on this day it was particularly photogenic, dramatic, and I think quite sympathetic to the landscape as well. And one thing I have tried to do with this project is represent the Scottish weather in all its variety, which has included a lot of overcast days. But the following morning was surprisingly good, despite a dire forecast. And this was a composition that I was very pleased with. But in this case, it's actually the colours that bother me. There's a fairly insipid combination of green and a sort of electric blue. And I don't really like to play around with colours too much. I did try that with this image, but no matter what I tried, I wasn't really happy. So this is maybe one to return to when the light's a little better. But the light improved that morning, and I wanted to show you a few images here because I don't always succeed with my composition, and particularly in complex areas when the light is unexpectedly good. I suspect I suffer from the same problems as all of you, running around like a bit of a headless chicken trying to make the most of the opportunities. But this feels a bit lopsided to me, and including this boulder, it just feels a bit forced and yeah, beginnerish actually, despite the amazing sky overhead. And similarly here, you could hardly hope for better lighting, and of course it is inherently beautiful as a result. But all the quality of line here is very static, and so all of the lines are running horizontally in this case. There's no real way of moving around the scene easily, and it again feels a bit unbalanced with those tufts on the bottom left. similarly, this image, this is an approach that I used to take. Just shoot as wide as you can, include everything in the frame, and of course you end up with something that's so epic that everybody's going to think this is awesome. But for me, this is creatively a bit lazy. I don't think that it shows much of me as a photographer. I don't think it's a particularly clever composition. All I've really done is just include everything. And so I try to avoid this kind of approach. I occasionally fall back to it, but it wasn't the right one for this scene. But later on, I found this scene, which was a little simpler, balanced a bit better. I liked the texture in the water, and the way the grasses were blowing in the wind almost gave them this natural glow, which I was really pleased with. And even losing the mountains to a bit of cloud, for me, that creates the implication that the mountains might go on a little bit higher than they actually do, because you can actually pretty much see the top of Evasion there on the right. In fact, that is the true summit. So yeah, that was the one image I took home from that shoot. So by the end of that trip, I'd actually started to think, do you know what, I've really got a project here, because there's enormous potential in Fisherfield that I just didn't capture in my last project here, or in the last chapter of the last project, I should say. And so when Richard, who is actually, I think, watching this, joined me on a workshop, he booked me for a one-to-one trip, and I suggested Fisherfield, which he was very game for, which was very lucky for me because it meant that I could pick the locations. And he's a great guy to hike with as well, who's quite an independent photographer. So we went to this place, Craig Fierich. Again, please don't pick me up on my Gaelic pronunciations. Let's just say I should do better. That's the location here, and a rare drone shot. So I've only used it a couple of times ever in Scotland, but that was one of them. And we went there on a day that had perfect autumn color, the best I've ever seen, actually, but with a lot of weather coming through. This is looking back down the River Gruned out to the coast with a heavy shower passing through. And again, here blocking Anchelic. But this is another example of how you can use composition to perhaps show a different story. So the tail here is the trees on this little island in the foreground with the river set against the weather. So it's a weather image, really. You have a sense of the scale of the weather and this rain coming through. Whereas waiting a second and reframing slightly, and you can focus very much more on the woodland as the subject, and the weather becomes a very, very tertiary aspect of the photograph. And similarly here, the same idea, but perhaps a slightly stronger composition and certainly better cloud, and there's a bit more drama there in the mountains at the back. So this was another image that I chose to publish. But my favorite image from that day was this one, again, obviously from a very, very similar location, but framing the mountains with these lovely birch trees. And I think one of the reasons that I like this image is it has a painterly quality to it, which can be a very difficult thing to come across, actually, particularly if you're very straightforward with your editing. Obviously, you can do that with cross-processing, and some people do that to great effect. Mark Littlejohn springs to mind. But because I try to keep things incredibly realistic, it's rarely that way that it looks painterly. Incidentally, I know a lot of people aren't that fussed about this image, so be it. And then the weather came back for good, and the light started to fail, and we went out to a location, some lochans nearby, more as a scouting mission than anything else. But I ended up really enjoying the photography. I felt it was quite atmospheric, and what you can't see here is Anchelic, which should be more or less be straight ahead, and the Benjerrigs off to the right. And similarly here, the Benjerrigs would be towering above us on the right hand side and Anchelic on the left. But I don't really miss them too much, to be honest. And this, of course, makes use of the pine tree there. I'm trying to frame that so that it's very prominent. And the name of the loch, in which I have unfortunately forgotten the Gaelic name for it, does mean Pine Lake, Lochan Guvus or something along those lines. And then a stag on the way out. I don't really have any deer photos. I'm no wildlife photographer, but this was a really exciting moment for me. And so it was a photo that I included in the book because, yeah, I quite liked it. And it is part of the area. Okay, so by the end of that first year of photography, these are the images that I thought I was definitely going to publish. These are the images that I actually ended up publishing. So one of the things you can't do with these projects is be too ambitious right from the start. You do have to just get started. But of course, as I've taken more photos over the course of the last 4 years, I've become more ambitious with it. And so I have lost a lot of those early images. So a bit about project planning. This is the area. I mean, it was discussed earlier, and you're Scots, most of you, I think so, or at least a lot of you. So I suspect you will know this area. But the Great Wilderness is south of Ullapool and north of Torridon, sort of opposite the Outer Hebrides and to the northeast of Skye. And this is the map that I produced for the book, which I'll talk about a bit later. But of course, I did need to come up with some restrictions on this project and define what the Great Wilderness actually was, because it doesn't really have any specificity to it. So this was the area that I decided upon. And then I broke the book down into chapters, which then informed how I could tackle my photography, because of course I was looking for 20 to 30 images to publish for each area. So Anchelic and the Ben Jerrigs was the first chapter, this northern area. We're going to spend some time talking about Anchelic. And then the Fisherfield 6, although they are now known as the Fisherfield 5, because that northeastern peak there is 1 meter short of Monroe. It was found to be 914 meters, not 915, I think back in 2013. So it was downgraded. So some people now call this the Fisherfield 5, but I call it the Fisherfield 6. And then this is the area that I called Letter U, although the Letter U estate actually includes lots of the peaks that I've included in the Fisherfield 6. Yeah, that's I had to give it some appropriate name, and the estate is much larger, but actually that's the area that I think of as Letter U. And finally, Loch Marie, which is Scotland's biggest freshwater loch north of Loch Ness. But what I was really interested in here was the islands of Loch Marie, which, oh, there's Loch again, which we'll talk about a bit later. So those were the 4 chapters. But by the end of that first year, this is all the hiking that I had done, these red lines here. And more than that, a lot of those lines were just hiking routes. I hadn't really succeeded in my photography on any of that eastern section, save for on Anchelic. So I had my work cut out in quite a big way. So my process was to visit new locations. That was the priority, really, a fairly obvious priority, but also to focus on what I called the cornerstone images. And these were the images that I felt were sufficiently majestic that I could build entire chapters around those images if I was able to photograph them in a sufficiently successful way. And then, of course, just endless repetition going up these mountains again and again until I had what I was after. So a couple of new locations. Obviously, I'm not going to show you every new location that I photographed because we'd be here all day. But Loch Naberta was one of them. That's this loch here, right in the middle of the area, really, and quite remote. This is the hiking route that I took with another workshop group the following COVID summer. So everybody was pretty unfit, including me. And this was far too hard, I have to say, for day 1 of a workshop. But everybody did get there. And of course, you build a lot of camaraderie going through a pretty tough process, tough hike like that. And this was the Google Earth view that gave me a sense that actually this was an area that was worth visiting. I incidentally couldn't find any hikers' photos or any photographers who'd visited this loch before, although inevitably others will have been here before me. But this was as we approached the loch towards the end of the day. Long summer days in May, fortunately. And then we got the tents up, just about found room for all of our, again, socially distanced tents. It is pretty easy generally in Scotland to find room for even a large number of tents, but this was a slightly trickier spot. And you can see to the bottom left, just above the leftmost tent, there's a boulder there. And that was actually the best subject that I found. And when the light improved in the evening, this is the image that I captured. I did actually shoot this rock in full sunlight as well, but it was too contrasty. So this is actually in sort of quarter light. The sun is just peeking around the edge of a cloud, and that allows me to reveal all the color in the rock without the contrast becoming too great. This is a piece of Lewisian gneiss. So that was an image, a geological image again, that I was very pleased with. And you can see how that does mirror what Google Earth was showing me. And then this last May, I actually ran a trip in Fisherfield again with Joe Cornish. Unfortunately, we weren't so lucky with the weather on that trip. And this was the final camp we did. The weather was forecast to be incredibly windy, and on that previous visit I'd noticed this little delta on the edge of the loch, which I suspected would be dry enough and sheltered enough to be a nice camp spot, and so it proved, which was very fortunate. But it's always good to keep these spots in your memory bank for just such an occasion. This shot works okay. I find it a little bit obvious, but I did hunt around a bit more, and I found, oh, and there's the campsite in a close-up, and I found this rock a little later on the following day, actually, which I really loved. This almost flame-like shape with some amazing metamorphosed lines in the gneiss. So I'm very pleased with that photograph, and actually it's up on the wall just to my right. These overcast scenes with less colorful light are more and more appealing to me, I have to say. And then Ben Lair, which was another ridiculous mountain not to have included in the last attempt at this area, I have to say, but I visited this actually 4 times in the final year of the project, so I really went at it hard. And those 2 arrows there show the primary directions where the best views are. So this is looking towards Angelic. In fact, this is the other direction, sort of splitting those 2 arrows in 2 at sunset. On my first visit, again with a one-to-one client, I tend to offer these discounted trips if I get to decide on the itinerary. So this was another guy who's brilliant company called Andrew. Yeah, very lucky on our first evening there. Lovely golden light, and although it was April, there's not the slightest hint that summer has begun. And the following morning, a very different atmosphere, and actually just as interesting to me. And from a variety perspective for a book, it's great to have both color themes, although it was that previous image that I ended up using. But on a much later trip, not last May, but the May before that, we had, again, a pretty terrible trip in terms of wind. We had to camp low for the entire trip, but the one day that looked like there might be a sunset was the final day. And so we did a late hike up the mountain, and of course this is 10:15 or something like that at night, high on the mountain, with still a long hike to get down to the tents, but everybody was up for the challenge. And this was a rather remarkable sunset, looking down over Glen to Lacha and towards the Fisherfield 5, or 3 of them anyway, Fisherfield 6. And then just moments later, a little shower passed through, and of course the red light of sunset means that the prism of the rainbow is very much biased towards red, because all of the blues and greens have been largely filtered out by the haze. So you know, to get us really bright, colorful image like that is brilliant for the purposes of a book, because it provides genuine variety. And a little bit earlier, this was the view looking out over Fionloch and to see towards Pool U, which is right at the coast there where we walked in from. And I've got the order of this wrong intentionally, because I thought I would also show you the fact that I will often reshoot compositions verbatim when I'm happy with them. This was the winter version. I did end up photographing or using the summer version in the end, because it was a bit more dynamic and interesting, but still nice to see how things change in the snow. And this is a trip that I'll be talking about extensively in the second half of the talk. So onto this idea of cornerstone images, these key images that I felt the book had to have. Ben Arichar we already talked about with this image here, but I really wasn't happy with the color palette of this. It just felt over the top and unpleasant, and a lot of the focus ended up being on the sky rather than the amazing landscapes. I wasn't entirely happy with this image, particularly because the image that I published in the previous book was this one, which I actually preferred. So I needed to keep going back there until I had something a bit more interesting. And this was the conditions I had with a one-to-one client on top of Ben Arichar this April, or past April. Really beautiful changeable conditions with the clouds rolling over the hills. And this is one of the early images that I took, which I think works very well. Really, I could quite happily have published this were it not for two issues. One is that the mountain evasion would end up right on the fold of a double page spread, which I think would be a little bit awkward. But also I noticed this scene to the right, this little pool. It's actually Loch an Fada there. I thought that that was an interesting scene in its own right, and so I wanted to reframe, to leave that out of the shot, to sort of get two images out of the same scene. So this was the panorama that I ended up publishing, and you can see the page fold would fall much more naturally here. And that was the detail view, which I think does work on its own. So yeah, I'm at this point already shooting very much with an intent to produce images that are suitable for a book specifically. So then there's this view from Evasion, which was the sort of cover image. And this was the view that I photographed for the last book, which I felt would be very hard to improve upon because of the snow in the foreground, even though this was captured in May. But of course, we did have this unbelievable cloud setup. I could try that 100 more times and never be so lucky again. What an amazing thing to see. So that was at least that view in the bag early on. In fact, the very first trip I did to Fishfield. And then the view south, this was the following year. In fact, this was an old image that I never published because I wasn't happy with it. And I wasn't happy with it for one very specific reason. And again, it's the color palette. You've got every color under the sun in this image. We've got blues, we've got greens, we've got reds and oranges. And it's just all too much for me. It just feels grungy and unpleasant. It's really hard to explain how I see color, but it's a very important thing to me. And you can perhaps see what I mean when I show you this version that I reshot again in May, but a colder April and early May had produced you know, much later summer effectively. So the grasses are yellower, and so the color palette fits together a lot more naturally. And of course, the light is a lot more dramatic too. So we have better contrast, these lovely purples coming through in the sky. So that was incredibly exciting, having the opportunity to photograph that scene in such transcendent lighting. And Anchelic, another challenging scene to photograph, the view from Bidian Glas Tull looking towards Sker Fiona and the Corrug Buda pinnacles. This was the previous book's image, and again I could try again and again in the winter to get conditions like this and be unsuccessful, so it wasn't really an option to try and repeat this in winter. So I took some summer photos which show the geology a lot more clearly, and of course are in stark contrast to that previous image. And this image I really liked, largely because the fog is hiding the ridge that would be to the left there, and so it makes Sker Fiona a more prominent peak. And of course you have this really remarkable Torridonian sandstone. There's only a few mountains which have examples of Torridonian sandstone which are quite so beautiful. So I was very, very pleased with that one as well. But it was on an autumn hike with this same Andrew who'd come with me to Ben Lair that we really got lucky. Now, this was a group trip, again on a COVID autumn, but One of the clients felt he wasn't fit enough, having had a recent bout of COVID, to get up a mountain, and the other unfortunately had an injury, and decided to go home early. So it was just Andrew and I who went up, and Chelak. And as we went up in completely hopeless conditions, I have to say, snow started to fall, and we were in the cloud room for maybe half an hour on top of the summit before it started to clear. And that's when I took this photo of Andrew, but it cleared further still. And this was the result. So a really, really marked contrast to that snowy image that I showed you before. And then because I'm producing a book, of course, I need a pair to that monotone, largely monotone image. If you put a colorful image next to that, it would look rather odd. So I tried hard on that day to photograph something that was going to work as its pair. And I almost like this image as much, actually. It's again quite atmospheric, but again, these beautiful examples of Torridonian sandstone, with the snow being the obvious icing on the cake in this case. Okay, so let's take a break. I'm sure you need one because I talk like a railgun. Let's reconvene at 8 o'clock.
That's great. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, if everyone wants to take a quick break, we'll pause the recording there. What I should say before we do go into a break is thanks to Colin Balfour and Mark Reeves from the Landscape Group as well, because this is a joint talk between RPS Scotland and the RPS Landscape Specialist Interest Group as well. So a big welcome to all the RPS Landscape Group participants as well. But if we take a break, and we'll see you back at 8 o'clock. Thanks, Alex. And we'll welcome Alex back for the second half. Thank you, Alex.
Brilliant. Okay, so hopefully everybody's had a cup of tea or has a cup of tea. And I thought I'd start with the Lochmaree Islands for this part of the talk, largely because I want to talk about them a little bit. They're not so easy to fit into a narrative because I've only been to the islands on 4 separate occasions, and I was very careful to visit them as little as possible because they're such a sensitive area. But most of the time, this is Lochmaree here. I spent hiking around the hills, and whenever I got a view of the islands, I would take photographs, but often I would pick out specific spots that I thought would give really good views of the islands, and this is probably the best. Craig Rua, Red Crag, basically, looking over the islands of Lochmaree with Slioch in the background, and this aspect of Slioch is particularly photogenic, I think. So I've been up this hill many times now, 4 or 5 times, partly because it's not too hard to access. It's about an hour's hike, really, which in Fishfield terms is nothing at all. So there's camped up with a group on a sort of rest day, so you can't really go up a high mountain every day if you're running a hiking trip, so you do need to have some lower camps, and this was one of those. And that morning, even though it was hazy, we had some lovely early twilight conditions, and cat's paws moving across the loch, so there was some nice opportunities right from the outset, even though we couldn't see Slioch. And having the loch so calm was a real treat. I actually haven't had too many opportunities to photograph with calm water and reflections. Maybe I will in future years. And it's interesting to photograph abstracts when you have these small, in this case, subjects. This tiny little island here, with the light just bleeding over the top of Ben Lair. And as the morning progressed, those light rays started to creep over the hill and produce subtle rays initially, but of course they still do add an extra dimension to this image. So one thing that you do have to do as a landscape photographer is be constantly aware of how the light is changing and how your compositions might be altered to adapt to that lighting. And a little later, and those rays got really quite strong, and you can see they're starting to catch the islands there on the right of the frame as well. So a really, really lovely morning, despite the fact that we couldn't see Slioch at all. And this was an earlier view I captured from Ben Ari Char than the one that I showed you previously. So here you can see that those trees actually haven't yet been removed on the right-hand side of the frame, though some of them have. So you don't have that distraction. So in some ways, this works better. But nevertheless, as a photograph of the islands, the mountain itself is intruding at the bottom of the frame there, and it obviously clashes with the island. So whenever I'd been up Ben Ari Char before, I'd thought, well, maybe I should walk up Ben Ari Char and then back down the other side to the top of one of these crags to get a closer view of the islands. So that's what I did, again with Andrew. This is all on the same trip, by the way. And this was in the middle of the day, so the light wasn't ideal, but still I felt that this panorama might be publishable just as a summer day image. You don't want a book full of endless sunsets. It gets a bit boring after a while. But when I got home, I did realize that there were two really strong individual frames. In fact, I shot them at the time, but it wasn't until I got home that I realized, yeah, it's worth going back to get this in better light. And so on another occasion, I actually paddled across Loch Marie instead from the main road and hiked up the other side on my own. And these were the views in slightly better lighting. So looking towards those tiny little islands. Those islands at the bottom of the frame really are perfect. Very, very fortuitous to have that alignment. And this actually I like just as much, particularly for the detail in the center of the frame there, this very shallow pool with the shadows of the trees just stretching out across those waterlogged grasses. But there is only so much you can shoot from afar. So I actually went out there once with my wife, Emily, and our little dog, Fig, our little terrier, is actually at the front of her boat. He trusts her a little bit more than me, I think. And another rare flight for the drone, just to give you a sense of the area. But we have these pack rafts, which are inflatable boats, which you can lash a backpack onto if you want to, although in this case I was actually just wearing it on my back because it was nice and light. And they're very slow, but they are packable, and so it's feasible for me to drive up to Loch Marie to boat on it. And this was a view one afternoon looking towards Slioch. And the really amazing thing about these islands is that you can surround yourself in Scots pine. You know, it's one of the few fragments of the original Caledonian forest that remains. And of course, much of that forest was actually naturally destroyed by the advancing peat bogs after the last ice age. But a lot of it was also felled, as is the case around Loch Marie, where a lot of trees were felled, both for the ironworks, which is on the north shore, and for one of the World Wars. I think it's World War One. A lot of the trees were felled, but it's like going back in time, visiting these islands. They really are remarkable and a very precious area in the UK. This was one of the more spectacular moments of light that I had the opportunity to photograph. And actually on this evening, I ran around like I've never run before, because some of the shots I wanted to take were several hundred meters apart, and the ground's quite boggy. So it was pretty tough getting about. But one challenge I did have when photographing Loch Marie in general was that you almost always want to include this mountain Slioch because it's just so impressive, so beautiful, so dramatic, that it became too regular a feature in my images. And I realized that fairly early on. So I was always trying to think of ways to exclude it. So I actually shot this scene as a panorama on its own, which for some reason has disappeared from the presentation. But yeah, I basically just cropped out the entire mountain at the top there, and that will appear as a double page spread in the book, which does give you a bit of breathing space as well. You don't want mountains absolutely endlessly. And this was earlier that same sunset, and one of my favorite images in the book, actually, although again, I find that most people have other favorites. Maybe a little bit difficult from an editing standpoint. Again, lots of contrast in this scene, but some amazing light happening on the hill behind and the mountain beyond. And to me, this has a bit of a feel of the African savanna. But if you go onto waterlogged islands on a calm day, you do get midges, and they were pretty bad on this day, not nearly as bad as I have had. Sometimes you get a sort of cloud of them, but of course they get pretty much everywhere, and I do seem to attract an undue number of them. But it's worth it to see scenes like this one, and I photographed this scene in many different ways, actually, as a panorama, as more of a 2x3, which I actually ended up using in the book as a portrait frame. And again, I will try to do that and modify my compositions where I have subjects that will allow for that kind of change. But I did need a pair for that image because it was so pink. And so when I went back on another trip, that was certainly something I was looking for, was how can I make use of the pink clouds, but also create something that's very different to that other image, so that you've not got just two of the same on opposite pages. And this submerged Scots pine, I think, does a pretty good job of doing that. Of course, this would have worked on its own without the background at all, but I felt it was a stronger image, including the trees at the back. And then a twilight image, which this actually rounds out the book, because it's sort of nice to finish with that idea of a transition into night, I think. But a very, very beautiful twilight. And it was also a good opportunity to photograph just forest. I mean, you can't even tell that you're on islands here, of course, but yeah, a nice rich green image taken in the summer. There are so many of these images that are taken in the summer, even in the months of July and August, and yet so few of them have bright greens that would really suggest it's summer, such is the nature of the tundra in Scotland. These dead Scots pines also make an incredibly interesting subject. This is looking towards Benanoin in Torridon, which I also used in some of my other compositions. So this was, again, this same amazing evening, and another composition that I'd prepared earlier so that I could run around and just repeat the shots in some really nice lighting. And one of my favorites from the islands, looking towards Torridon, but with Liach there on the left, a bit more prominent, and Benachirkil as well. And I think the arrangement of trees here just worked out very well. It can be difficult to find separation when you haven't got any atmospherics going on. And here, of course, the trees were far enough apart that I think that worked fairly well. So I have done many trips as part of this project, but none were more ambitious than my hike up Evasion in the winter. And in fact, the only trip I've done that's more ambitious was an 18-day trip in Greenland in 2015. So although this was a short trip, it was pretty tough. I'll just have a sip of my tea. So there's the map again. And one thing I knew was that if I was going to represent every season in this book, I needed to be very productive on my final attempt, because all of the previous winters were either ruined by COVID or incredibly mild weather. And the Northwest Highlands is particularly susceptible to mild weather because it is so close to the coast. It's a lot more snowshore over in the Cairngorm, certainly, but also in Glencoe you often get much better snow. But the Northwest Highlands really do struggle for snow on many years, and there were some years that were just completely snowless, and one fairly decent spell where I couldn't travel because of travel restrictions, which meant that I actually had to go when I'd got back from the Drakensberg. I checked the forecast when I was in South Africa and saw that basically 2 days later there was going to be a cold snap, which meant that I left Johannesburg at 30 degrees Celsius, and 48 hours later I was in Pool U at -6, hiking with somebody that I'd actually never met before, who I put a shout out on Twitter to see who wanted to join, and this guy Mez said he did. But one thing you really have to pay attention to in the winter is the weather. To a certain extent, anything could happen in the summer. I mean, especially when I'm on my own. My tent's been destroyed on pretty remote mountains in the summer, and you just walk off the mountain. It's not actually that dangerous as long as you keep your wits about you. But in the winter, it's a completely different ballpark, and you have to be sensible. And you particularly have to be sensible with knowing where the snow is going to be, both for avalanche conditions, but also because if you're walking through deep snow, it might just stop you simply because it's too hard to make progress. And the snow came down on a northerly wind. And what that means is that the leeward slopes, the southern facing slopes, were going to gather the snow more than the more wind stripped northern slopes. And there were these two hikes that I thought would be sufficiently productive for me that would, justify using this rare, brilliant forecast of winter weather with snow and proper cold. And one was coming in through the heights of Kinloch-U, from Kinloch-U, and setting up camp at Loch an Fada there, and then heading up to some of those Fisherfield 6 peaks, which up to that point I hadn't really got images I was quite happy with from. But the other option was to just repeat this route that I'd done many times before and be incredibly productive on mountains and routes that I knew like the back of my hand from this point. And what really sealed the deal was the fact that the snow loading meant that really I couldn't do that other route because I would potentially be in this situation where the snow was too deep or too dangerous to walk on. And of course, you just don't know until you get there. So that's why I chose this route in from Pool U. And that's what we actually ended up doing in the event. So the first night we arrived at Pool U at 8 p.m. And we were immediately on black ice. In fact, I was very lucky that Mez came up in a 4x4 with winter tires, because my car never would have got to Pool U even. But we were walking on black ice all the way to the end of the Kernesary Forest there, which is that green patch. And that meant that we fell over many times initially, and then it just became too dangerous. So we switched to walking in crampons for a good 5 or 6 kilometers, which gave me blisters right from the start. And it's very rare that I get blisters, but I had blisters for the duration of this trip. Pretty miserable walking in crampons on hard ground, I have to say. And then we just carried on pushing. We really couldn't stop at all. I snapped this on my iPhone so you can see just how incredibly beautiful it was, walking under moonlight. Once we were out into the open like this, we could turn our head torches off and just walk by moonlight, which was wonderful. But there just wasn't time to stop, and that's one of the great challenges of taking this approach. I think sometimes people trivialize mountain photography and say something like, well, if I was up on that mountain, I could get that image. But they completely forget about all of the things that are required to get up the mountain. And it means giving up on a lot of photographic opportunities. And that is just the nature of the beast, that most of my time is spent hiking, not taking photographs. But we did get to our camp spot not far from the causeway. In fact, you can see that causeway directly above the tent there. And we arrived at 1 a.m. absolutely knackered, and ate a whole load of food, excuse me. And then immediately went to sleep at about 1:30, having cleared the ground of snow, so that, because we were planning to stay here a few nights, and you can be a little bit warmer if you clear the snow away. But then we were up again in the morning at 7 o'clock, ready to get hiking, to do this clockwise loop that you see on the right hand side here. So that first walk in is 15 kilometers. That second day, although it looks short, it was actually an 18-kilometer loop by the time you've tracked every step. So a pretty massive distance to do in the snow, which of course we had from the outset. More had fallen overnight. But when we woke up at 7 o'clock, it was completely cloudy. You couldn't see anything at all, which was good because it did give us an excuse to have a bit of a line and eat a lot more food, knowing that we had a big day ahead of us. And we set out when the clouds started to lift. I guess it would be at about 9:30-ish. When it brightened up a little. So here's Mez walking along one of the beaches on Fionloch, which I've swum in on many days, but not in the winter. And then up the footpath past Canmore, where I took a few photos myself. This just appears very small in the book because it doesn't quite have the level of interest I would generally look for. I couldn't find a foreground that really worked with this scene, but very beautiful all the same. Ben Arichar is that peak on the right, by the way, Ben Lair on the left, and I won't attempt to pronounce the peak in the middle. One of the areas I was worried about was the sort of middle ground. There's a sort of a hanging valley almost as you head up towards Evasion, and the snow was deeper there, but still not too bad. And again, there were scenes here that I could have spent time photographing, but we just had to push on. This scene in particular, I think, would have been quite fun to spend some more time with. In fact, the more I look at it, the more I like it. But there you go. Yeah, and then this is Ruistack Moor, one of those Munros, and I would have loved to have got a really good photograph of this peak. So I did spend just 5 minutes. We stopped 7 minutes for lunch, 7 minutes exactly. That was the only rest we had before summiting. And I think this composition works well for sort of theoretically. I think the elements are positioned fairly well, but it still doesn't quite work for whatever reason. Perhaps it's the massive swath of blue sky at the top of the frame there. I'm not quite sure, but didn't end up going for that one in the end either. And yeah, actually, if you look on the right-hand side here, you can see our route into the mountains. And it was there that we were walking on a south-facing slope. And I figured it would be nightmarish because there's a lot of scree in there as well. And it was tough, but actually we worked at it really hard. We took turns to break trail, and we got there actually ahead of when I thought we would, which was great because we could then just keep pushing. And at this point, with the final 300 meters of ascent on fairly wind-stripped slopes to get to the top of Evasion, I was getting very excited because I realized that I had a pretty good shot of achieving a dream here. This is just another very quick snap, looking back towards those Fisherfield Mountains, Skirban, and oh god, why do I forget the names of the mountains sometimes? I don't know. There's too many of them, I suppose. Ben Tarsman is the mountain on the right, anyway. And yeah, pushing on up those final slopes, and you can see much shallower snow here because the wind has stripped the slope, which is brilliant if you're walking. And then this is just shy of the summit, doing a little celebratory pose there with Anchelok in the background, which was one of my goals to photograph from the top of Evasion, because I didn't really have anything from the top that I felt was quite publishable, quite of the caliber that I was after. So this is the image that I shot, which still wasn't quite what I was after. Again, it's very hard for me to explain sometimes why some images feel successful and others don't, but this one maybe feels a little bit flat because the light is directly behind me. In fact, I did clone my shadow out in this case, or the shadow of the tripod, I should say, because what you do is put the camera on a 10-second tripod and then run away quickly without disturbing the snow enough that it ends up on your foreground, of course. So yeah, I didn't publish that one either, but it was still a very lovely scene to photograph. And this is what the summit plateau looked like. This is Mez, my hiking companion, and me setting up for a shot here. This is the view from the summit that I'd photographed that previous May, a long time ago, back in 2013 this was. And so this was the arrangement of hills that I wanted to photograph, and I knew I at least had that. But of course, my intent always was to find a foreground, and generally where you have flat areas of snow on mountaintops and it's been windy, you will find sastrugi, and that is what we did find up there. So this was one attempt at it, but you can see there's too much of the ridge is missing in the cloud, really. And the texture is actually a little bit messy, but I hunted around a bit more, and now you can see these lovely snaking lines leading towards the mountain, and the mountains themselves are a bit more revealed in the cloud. And I even like that they're slightly obscured because it gives them a slightly ethereal feel to them. But the one issue I have with this is the contrast in the foreground. The sunlight is still fairly strong. And even with lifting the shadows, it looks a bit too contrasty to me. And I was aware of that at the time. And so I was really just waiting for the right gust of wind. So you can see a few photos here where there's the odd gust coming, but not that much is happening. And here we finally got some nice lines in the snow. But it was this scene where the wind really picked up for a moment, and it softened those lines and almost made the foreground glow. And again, it's that natural glow that is so beautiful here. And then this is the edit. So you can see, so here's the original. I'm aware there might be a lag on your screen, so I'll do this a little slower. And you're just going to see it brighten. Just some very minor adjustments there, and you can see no temptation to correct any little imperfections or anything like that. Not that there are too many in that rather ideal scene. And then we've got this view south, which of course I've already got my epic version of in again, wondrous lighting conditions. So I need something different if I'm going to photograph this in the snow. This is all a bit too contrasty, and it of course would only get more contrasty with the sun dropping out of that cloud. And there's a color clash between these sort of orange yellows and the cyans almost in the foreground, even when I've desaturated it like I have here. Oops. But there was a moment where the light was bleeding across Benet and Liech in the back there. So I showed you this almost this exact frame, but as a twilight version earlier. But of course, this is a lot prettier, and I think even better as a portrait frame. It got that fantastic transition of colors. Really, really lovely to be able to photograph that kind of scene, and a rare opportunity to shoot something a little bit more abstract as well. I'm not sure that it's sufficiently abstract that you don't know what you're looking at, but nevertheless it has graphic qualities and maybe asks a few more questions than might ordinarily be possible with a grand landscape image, which are by their very nature highly illustrative. And another shot of me taking a photo, so you can see where I stood. There's actually quite a big drop both behind me and in front of me. So yeah, I mean, in the snow, again, you do have to be a little bit sensible. I wouldn't want to be stepping too much further forward, that's for sure. But this is the scene that I was photographing, and you can really only get this color palette in the snow in lovely clear air. I mean, these colors are just stunning. They really are. I would have loved to freeze this light and take photos for an hour, but of course it doesn't quite work out that way. And again, this image, which I showed you earlier, one of my cornerstone images, where I'd had this amazing summer sunset already. I had to still try and shoot this in the snow. And one of the reasons I had to try was because when I first came up here, which was even before this image, I had this idea, wouldn't it be amazing to photograph this in the snow? And this is a long time ago now, 10 years ago. And I was aware that probably no serious landscape photographer had got up there in the winter in snow conditions, because it is so hard. And I don't think anybody has been up there since, but it was a long held dream of mine. And so to get up there in the snow and see this scene, which I was saving for the very, very last moments of light, so that I could have this softness, this hint of pink in the foreground that wouldn't compete with the view, but would just sort of delicately touch on the snow and allow me to show this nice curve in the foreground. I waited until that very last moment to capture this frame, and I have to say it was a very emotional moment for me. I struggled to hold back the tears. I don't know if that's an embarrassing thing or not, but it was the realization of a very long held dream, and really the pinnacle of my photographic achievement in Scotland from a physical standpoint, at least. So yeah. And then this was the image of Anchelic that I ended up using in the end. So much simpler than that first image. This actually is the contents page. Yeah, again, just delicate light, very simple, but a lovely mountain. And sometimes you don't need to force foregrounds into the frame. And that's actually the case with many of my images. I won't introduce a foreground unless I need to. So Mez was complaining about the cold for quite a while. I have to say, I'm afraid that I completely refused to leave the mountain until the light had more or less failed. I did actually hand in my down jacket because there was just no way I was going down. But we did head down when twilight started to approach. So this was one of the last images that I took on the summit. You can see the belt of Venus starting to appear there. This, unfortunately, as much as I love it, is the kind of image that I can't publish simply because I kind of have too many versions now of these hills in the snow. But yeah, nice to photograph all the same. And because we'd had such an epic day, we decided that we weren't going to go back the way we came. We were going to complete this loop, which I had done once before in the summer, so I knew it was safe. So this is heading down towards Loch Fada, or Lochan Fada. And that was actually the last image that I did take and publish. And in fact, it wasn't, because this was one of the reasons to go down that other way. This was a scene that I photographed on a hike with my friends and my dog and my wife Emily, prioritized not in that order, incidentally. And I thought that this would be a really great image in nice light, but not in midday sun like this. And actually, it's an awkward spot to get to, so I suspected that I wouldn't have the opportunity to photograph it. But in the twilight in winter, it was very lovely. Maybe this snow slope was a bit too strong though in the foreground, and so in the end I went for a tighter crop with these ridges interlocking here, and you've actually got 3 mountains in the scene, and one of the sort of subsidiary ridges between them. Oops, I knocked that wheel again. And then back to the tent. So we were back at the tent just before 8 p.m. which meant that in 24 hours, we had walked from the car, set up camp with heavy packs, and then gone all the way up Evasion with still pretty heavy packs, even though we didn't have our camping kit and food with us, and got back to the tent walking 33 kilometers in snow that was really quite deep at some points in less than 24 hours. So it really was an enormous physical challenge. But of course, when you're rewarded like that, it becomes one of the best experiences you've ever had, which is one of the great things about combining hiking with photography. So there was one final adventure. In fact, there were to be many adventures after that December trip, which was last December. And the great thing about that trip, aside from the trip itself, was that I had my winter images, which meant then that I could publish the book, which meant that the pressure was off and I could just enjoy my photography without any particular goals, and just improve upon what I had, or hunt out new locations, try something different. And that's a really, really fun way to photograph after having the pressure of a project. But as it turned out, May was awful, and so was the previous winter trips that I'd planned as well. The weather was bad. There was a lot of warm weather, and so in the end I plugged in a final extra trip in August, and it really was the last chance saloon. So this was the route that I ended up doing, although I planned something far more ambitious, because by the time I got up there, the weather forecast had worsened considerably, and I kind of did the route out of bloody mindedness, just to say that at least I'd tried. But it wasn't too bad when I set out. This is the walk up the heights of Kinloch U, part of the Cape Wrath Trail, incidentally. And you can see next to the building here a hiker. This is Tobias, who I waited for in the hopes that we could walk together for a while, which we did. And he took this photo of me, which is very handy. And it was peak heather time, and I really enjoyed the walk, and I really enjoyed chatting with Tobias. And I try to enjoy myself when I'm hiking as well. I don't like to just be completely obsessive about my photography to the point that I can't enjoy myself. That isn't the point for me at all. And there was certainly potential there with this heather and with these views over Lochan Fada. And I actually wanted to get more images of Letter U out of this trip. So that is this southern area. but it didn't quite work out that way. But yeah, this was a lovely guy to hike with. We set the world to rights as we walked, and complained about Brexit and all sorts of stuff. It's funny what you end up talking about with hikers you've never met before. But this was the area that I had come to visit. So these are the slabs beneath. Well, this is Skirdu, this peak here. I'm lost, finally forgotten the name of the mountain. It's the same one I forgot earlier. Anyway, but some massive slabs, which are geologically very unusual. This ridge line here is a more quartzite geology, so you haven't got this Torridonian sandstone, and consequently I felt it would be an interesting way to introduce variety into the book. This is a photo I took more as a reference than anything else. It was interesting to see that the trees were becoming autumnal, even though this was the end of August. And actually, it was very cold and wet on this trip. And it was the week before that incredible heat wave in the first week of September. And I remember 1 week later, I was actually in Frome in Somerset, and I could barely walk around. It was so hot. So yeah, quite the change in weather. But this shot doesn't really work because there's just no separation between the trees and each other, but also the background. And perhaps it's a little unbalanced, but sort of interesting anyway. And I went through the paces to a certain degree, but I was mostly interested in the main slab itself, and particularly this chute of water. So this is the smaller of two sections of slabs, and the other section of slabs is 10 times as big by area, but this is the one that has a little stream running over it, which I hoped would provide some photographic potential. And you can see it here, even though these aren't wonderful compositions. But this one I think does work, and it has that atmospheric feel, but also a really graphic quality coming from this strong diagonal, which again does introduce that bit of variety into the book. So some of the images that I've chosen are not just because they're absolute bangers, it's because they produce that all important variety. So I did shoot it a couple of different ways. I actually chose this one. I felt was a better image than the sort of more close-up, wider photo. And then I carried on up the hill because I actually only had 30 minutes at the slabs that I had walked 5 hours to get to, because the rain came. So that, that's just the way it goes. And the rain didn't really stop all evening. Plenty of deer around bellowing in the night. And I found a very soggy place to spend the night, and didn't sleep very well because I had a tiny leak in my mat, which, although I had a repair kit, I just could not find this leak. So I was re-inflating the mat every hour or so, which of course wasn't amazingly enjoyable. But I also managed to get a mountain weather forecast from a friend by texting him with my satellite messenger, and the forecast for the following day had got a lot worse still, so high summit winds. And so I was just in a really negative mindset, I have to say. But I continued on the following day up to the top of Muluk Korivik Ferrica. That's the name of the mountain that I was trying to come up with. So that's the summit of this mountain here. You see this broken quartzite geology, again uglier than that Torridonian sandstone. I think that's fairly objectively true. But nevertheless, part of the story of these mountains, something I wanted to photograph. So this is atmospheric, but maybe not good enough. And the sun, of course, hinted that it might come out again and again. And I waited up on this mountain for several hours in the hope that it would break free, but it never did. And I headed down only to pop straight out of the clouds. So this is only 100 meters below the summit. But this actually was a photograph that I was happy with, that I published. There's a few things that I really enjoy here. The ridge and the hills beyond, combined with this cloud, I think it is a nice backdrop. But you also have this fascinating scree slope of these repeating lines, lovely pattern there. And then you've got this diamond-shaped piece of quartz arenite, which I hunted around this slope for some time to find. But when I found it, I knew that was the subject I was after. And for reference, this was on a hike a few years previous, so I had photographed that backdrop before, but it was really this foreground that I think elevates the image that little bit more. But then I bailed because the forecast for that night was awful. There was something like a 10% chance of cloud-free Monroes according to the mountain weather forecast, and 45-mile-an-hour summit winds, which you can just about camp in, but you're going to have a pretty miserable time. And I thought, you know what, I've earned my stripes now, I've had my adventures, I've got my images, it's time to head back. So I did take some last images of the heather, which are published very small in the book, but then I was off, and glad to be off. But I did have a few days spare, and so I went down to Strathcarron, which is just south of Torridon, to stay with a friend who runs a cafe called the Old Butchers, and he's also a superb photographer. He's called Joe White, and do stop by his cafe if you're down in that part of the world, because they have the best coffee in the area, but they also have the best photography in the area. He's a really excellent photographer. But a couple of days later, we did have a little bit of hope in the forecast, at least in the satellite forecast. It looked like the clouds were more broken than the main forecasts were saying. And so we gambled on Loch Marie, and going up to this, I mean, not really a high point, really 40 minutes from the road, just to get a new perspective on the Loch Marie Islands, having photographed in these two other spots before. Incidentally, two of my previous workshop clients, Steve and Steve, who'd got on great on a trip, had done their own hike in Fisherfield and had subsequently told me that they'd had a horrendous time in the bad weather. So at least I had made the right decision to bail out. But yeah, we had one last crack at the whip on this hill. And it was a day of sunshine and showers. And as we drove along Loch Marie, we saw these rainbows starting to appear. And I just knew we were going to have an amazing photography session. So this was fairly early on. And I took this photo actually partly to show the foreground. And this is an example of where somebody might try to introduce the foreground because that's what landscape photographers do. But for me, any foregrounds that I could find here were just competing with the backdrop, which has so much beauty that you don't really want to detract from it. So this is a shower sweeping in from the coast looking towards Gairloch here. So we were getting wet pretty regularly. You obviously can't avoid these showers entirely, but some would hit you, and some would miss, and some would miss the islands, going behind the islands. And if you wait around enough, you can pretty much get exactly the light setup that you want. So one of the things I thought was it would be great to have the island that you see on its own there in sunlight. If I waited around and more showers came through and the wind would pick up as these showers arrived, you know, again, you keep taking photographs because you never know what kind of variety you might want for a project like this. So I didn't publish this image, but again, that's why I'm capturing it. And here, looking over the plantation, you know, I wouldn't publish this one simply because it's got a road in it and an ugly forest, but pretty incredible conditions all the same. And there is that island in the sunlight, very deliberate. It's a photo that I was just waiting for 3 hours in these passing showers, but it will pretty much inevitably happen where you've got this changeable weather. And then rainbows. I shot so many rainbows in this one afternoon. I almost doubled my Scottish rainbow count, to be honest. I think I've got a dozen images of rainbows. That rainbow, incidentally, is probably a bit too strong, but just incredible prismatic color. I love rainbows. I've never got tired of them. And this is a good example of Alexander's dark band. Actually, you can see there's a dark area between the primary and secondary bow where there's a bit of destructive interference, if you remember your physics, whereas it's fully reflecting the sunlight inside that primary bow, and that's why you get this rather strange contrast. Yeah, another image with the rain falling, this time on Ben Arichar, and another rainbow So, I mean, I've just got millions and millions of these images from this one shoot, which of course is brilliant when you come to selecting images for a book because you've got lots of choice. This was one I did publish. This island, by the way, is the only island on Loch Maree that's really had the hand of man, because there are some planted beech trees on this island, and there are a lot of gravestones as well, because the local estate used to bury their dead there. And the last rainbow, right as the sun was getting red, and so again you can see this bias towards the reds in the rainbow there. Okay, so a little bit on the book itself, and I'm conscious of time, but I did a lot of image selection, but particularly rejection. These are all the images after I deleted the really bad ones that I shot on that winter trip. So several hundred images, and I actually shot several thousand images in the course of the project, often because I was shooting panoramas or exposure brackets, or just shooting the same scene again and again to get that perfect moment. But certainly a lot of images to wade through. This is a scene that I would love to return to. I think as it is, it works fairly well, but the light's just a little bit flat. So that one doesn't quite make the grade. Here, the most sensational lighting, but no composition really to speak of, and that's largely because I was focusing on the view behind me. This is the top of Ben Llwch, and it has a remarkable perspective on Ben A. And apologies if you can hear my son crying there in the background. Then there are lots of images that get rejected simply because you have to pick one as the light is changing. And here I'm changing my composition as well, again, to get that variety. But obviously these images are shot within about a 20-minute period. And it's that first one to the top left that I chose simply because of this very soft nature of the sun filtering through the cloud there. Incidentally, even that sun is not as pink as you see it, because again, the sun needs to be bright, and if you keep it bright, it can't be as richly pink as you might like it to be. So yeah, that was the one that I ended up publishing. Others here, I like this image, but it's a rather obvious cliche. Many of you may even have photographed this tree if you've driven along Loch Maree, and it's using Slioch again, which is as I mentioned earlier, too regular a motif in the book already. Yeah, so this shows how I ended up using this image. So the crop to a double page spread, which I think does work very well on its own without the mountain. So that is something to be aware of when you're shooting these grand scenics, to always think about how you might break down the scene, even if that might at first seem to be an inferior choice. I didn't really have a photograph to go with this one. This is on the back of Anchellach, and I really wanted to include it, partly because it's satisfying putting little dots on the map everywhere where you've taken a photo that's gone into the book. But a fun scene to photograph. A bit of a self-portrait here. You'll see the Daily Mail pretty much on their website will have an article every year: man captures rare optical phenomena. This is a Brocken spectre. If you go up the mountains at all, you're pretty much guaranteed to see these on a fairly regular basis, though rarely quite as good as this. Again, it's down to the droplet size, a bit like rainbows. You need the perfect droplet size to get quite this intensity of color and the series of rings that you see here. And this is on Ben Tarsewin. It's referred to as the tennis court for fairly obvious reasons. So I did want to use this image, but actually it was just too much of an odd one out with my shadow in the frame there. And I considered this one. The mighty Joe Cornish felt that this wasn't quite as strong as the images from Ben Arichar, and maybe didn't add anything to the narrative. And I'm inclined to agree, to be honest. So maybe I'll return to this mountain one day. This was from Anchellach on a really wonderful morning hiking with friends. We actually camped beneath the cloud, and got up early to hike through it to get above the cloud inversion, and it was lovely being up there. But this fails for a whole host of reasons, compositionally and also tonally. I mean, it just looks incredibly HDR, of course, largely because it is. I've had to work really hard with the edit here to create anything that even vaguely resembles reality, but it ends up just looking a bit weird. And then here, one of the most dramatic moments of light that I photographed, particularly on that winter trip. And if I'd been on the summit of Ben Lair, undoubtedly I would have ended up publishing this image. But it just doesn't work compositionally because, of course, I was on my way up. I was walking along this ridge on the left and just didn't quite get there in time. But occasionally the opposite happens. So this one I rejected because I just felt that the light was maybe a little bit flat and the colors were a little washed out. But I showed this to Joe and he picked it out as one of his favorite images in the whole project. So you don't ignore advice from the great man. Image pairing is a very important aspect of book design, and it's often done poorly, in my opinion. There are some people who are absolute geniuses at it. On the other hand, Sandra Bartoka is one person, and Darren Curley-Leach is another. But I like to pair things on a color basis generally, because they're likely to work well, and quite often that means two images that have been captured on the same shoot, as these two were. And what I did with the book commonly was put my favorite image on the right and larger than the image on the left, because I think generally you pay more attention to the image on the right than on the left. So quite often the image on the left would set off the image on the right, give a bit more context. And this image, I picked this as one of my top 3 in the book because it again introduces those questions by leaving the ridge out at the top there. I think it creates a few strange ideas around scale and exactly what's going on, which again is a rare thing in grand landscape photography. Here, the image on the right, I was already very happy with. This was captured on a hazy trip when I was hiking with Joe Cornish. And I was very pleased with it, but I didn't have anything to go with it. So on subsequent trips, I was thinking to myself, right, it's hazy. Can I find an image that will pair it in the book? And that was a photo from Ben Jerrigmore on the left there. And here I'm pairing these images to transition between seasons from summer into autumn. So what follows is a number of autumn images in the book. And of course, the obvious tie here is the rain falling down over the mountains. And here I'm pairing on location. So this stream and small cascade here is looking up at Evasion, and Evasion is the mountain on the right hand side here that's just lost to the cloud. And towards the bottom right of that image, I think you can actually just about make out the exact waterfall that I was photographing there. But you don't want to go too far with this kind of idea. So this is shot on the same morning of the same loch in 180 degrees opposite to one another. And initially when I did this, I thought I was being quite clever, but actually it's a bit naff. And I showed this to Joe. So I went through a full review of all the images in the book with Joe, which is very kind of him to give up his time to me. And he kind of hated this, I think, though, of course, he would never let on that he hates anything. So he proposed switching that image on the right for this image, which I think was a very good change to make. And then I would also pair images and just decide that really they didn't work. And of course, here you've got more color on the left. And so I picked actually an image that I felt was slightly inferior, but which paired the image on the right a little better. So a very similar scene there, but in different conditions. And this again is why you want to have this variety in your portfolio when you're putting together a body of work like this. Lastly, onto the physical book itself. I won't linger on this too long, but I introduced some books into my some maps into my previous book, which are rather rudimentary. People were already telling me that this looked like Lord of the Rings, which already annoyed me at the time. So please don't ask me questions about Lord of the Rings maps. But I think if you create a map and put any sort of old writing on it, people say Lord of the Rings because it's this pervasive reference point for our culture. But yeah, they were rather rudimentary maps that I made with a combination of my own textures that I painted and some digital assets, but they didn't really convey too much. So I wanted to do something far more in keeping with a high-end production this time around. So I used this data set from Ordnance Survey and taught myself how to use mapping software. It's not that hard. So that data set gives you brightness pixels that represent the height of the terrain, and with the mapping software you can use those pixels to you can convert them into contour lines, as you see here. And you can actually see there's a lot of errors in these contour lines, which I had to manually clear up. So every little dot that you see there, every little island, I had to manually scrub out because it's just inaccurate. And from those contour lines, I made my own hypsometric tints, which are tints based on altitude. And I also had this hillshade layer, as it's called, which gives some lighting direction, so you can give the mountains a bit of form. And then there were vector layers for the lochs and lochans and sea, all different layers, and then major rivers and minor streams, which of course you don't want to be as dark and strong as the major streams, so you have to treat them differently. And then the contours you can add on the top, and with a very quick edit you end up with something like this. I say quick, this is probably 10-12 hours into the process, but with a lot more work and a bit of digital effects and a bit of my own textures, you can end up with a map like this. And then I did all my own calligraphy. So this is something that I actually started when I was 7 years old. My grandmother taught me. And this is a font called Unseal, which is a Gaelic font, so appropriate really for the area, but it is also very similar to the font used by Lord of the Rings for similar reasons, because it conveys this sense of the past. So that's me superimposing my calligraphy onto the map, and these small sections of map do appear inside the book at the start of every chapter, although I'm afraid that if you wanted the full-size map, that was only available for people who pre-ordered the book, along with my hiking routes, which you see here, which again aren't included in the book, but I marked every camp spot and photo location on that large-scale map. And then finally onto the cover design. I wasn't going to do that by halves either, so this was the rather simple Northwest cover design, which I was very happy with, but wanted to do something a bit more complicated. So this is a photograph of Anchelach from Ben Gerard Moore, and I used this to create this little drawing, which I then repeated in pen and ink and then turned into a vector, which was then turned into an embossing stamp for the cover of the book. So this adds an extra process into the production of the cover. So actually it adds over £2,000 to the production price just to stamp this mountain onto the cover. So an expensive choice, but I haven't cut any corners with this book. If you would like to order a copy of the book, it is only available on my website. It costs £49. It will only ever be available on my website unless I get really desperate, so don't go hunting for it on Amazon or anything like that. If you'd like to join me on one of these adventures, then please do check out my website or email me if you've got something in mind. And I think that is it. So if you've got any questions, I guess they're in the chat, then we can go through those.
That's great. Thanks, Alex. What a fascinating presentation you've given us tonight. Steve has been monitoring the chat box. I'll hand it over to Steve to go through some of the questions that are in the chat area. Steve?
Yeah, one of the first ones was about how do you obviously, because of the way you're talking, you're concerned very much about the composition and design of the photography. And the question was, how do you cope with publishing editors seeing things differently? So I guess because it's self-published, you just talk to yourself and got on with it. Is that how it works?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's, you could almost start an entire conversation there about self-publishing.
Yeah.
If you have a publisher, then they often will place demands on you and have a specific idea for what they think they can sell to their customers. So, for example, they might want more sunny day images that look lovely, like you're on holiday, for example. And I would never want to have those demands placed on my work, but particularly not when publishing is not an amazingly profitable thing in the first place, unless you're producing a book that sells serious numbers and you've negotiated a good percentage. So the best percentage I know on sales is 17% is the best I've heard the photographer getting, but that's generally on what the publisher gets, not on what the distributor might sell it for. So you might get £2 or £3 for each book. If I were to sell out all of these books, then I make enough money that I can actually pursue this as a profession. And there is very little money in landscape photography now, which is why many photographers pursue tours more or less as the only facet of their business. So that really is the reason to self-publish for me. But of course, you take enormous risk in doing that. So I was getting on for £37,000 in the hole to publish this book. So it's an enormous commitment. My salary is almost certainly less than everybody who's watching this. So it's quite a risk to take, but you do have to back yourself as an artist. But that's one of the reasons why I've taken such a committed approach. But as for picture editors having views on composition, unfortunately, I don't think there are many picture editors now which have a shared sense of what makes a good photograph, never mind what makes a good composition anymore. And I think the aesthetics of what constitutes a good photograph have changed over time, largely down to social media. So I think picture editors are more driven by effect now than they are composition.
Yeah, bam, thank you, man. Kevin was watching some of your photographs and said it was wonderful, but he did see the ones where you were packing all your stuff in the bag, and he's away to do a ridge climb in the Cairngorms this weekend, and he said he shares your frustration about all the winter kit you have to take, restricting the camera kit you have to take. So he's very much aware of that one.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say there is that photographers generally lumber themselves with too much gear. I think it's actually creatively a bad thing if you've got 10 lenses in your bag, because you're making choices, spending time making choices that actually don't matter too much. I would, you want to have decent coverage of focal length ranges, of course, but if you've got a 24-105, you probably don't need a 24mm tilt shift and all these specialist lenses that many people carry around. And thanks to digital processes like combining exposures, you really don't need graduated filters anymore either. So you can really work with a very stripped down kit, and even tripods now you can work with very lightweight tripods, because when the wind gets up, you can turn on the image stabilization, bump the ISO, and yeah, you can produce some pretty high quality images now.
Rob did ask about focus stacking. Do you do much of that?
I do very occasionally. So more commonly, I'll focus stack when I'm actually shooting at medium focal lengths, where the depth of field is a little bit shallower, and I might have something that's, say, 10 meters away, and then the background is infinity, and it just doesn't quite work without a focus stack. Generally, I think if I can't quite get it sharp in one image, then I'm too close to my foreground. I've started to stray away from images that have enormous amounts of perspective, because I find that to be a little bit distracting. So, for example, not many images are shot wider than 24mm for that reason. But occasionally I do focus stack. Yeah, I mean, really whatever technique is necessary to get the result.
Yeah. And Alistair was asking, so he was asking what your favourite part of Fisherfield was, and you came across quite strongly later on about talking about Joe Cornish. And he said, was that a big learning curve for you? Did you take away a lot from him?
Yeah. Well, so the best view for first, you can't really decide, I think, between Evasion and Angelic. So the view from Biddy and the Glass Tull on Angelic, but also the view from Scarfiona on Angelic, both absolutely outstanding, right up there amongst, I mean, anybody who's done Munros in Scotland would list Angelic in their top three, I'm pretty sure. Evasion would be my personal pick because the remoteness makes it more appealing to me. I guess it's probably bragging rights or something like that. I mean, I can't completely say that I'm mature enough to not care that I've worked hard for some of these images, because I do, and that does give me satisfaction. But the views from Evasion are similarly 360-degree views, and I wouldn't know how to choose between the two, but there are very few views that are comparable in all of Scotland, though there are a few in the Northwest Highlands. As for hiking with Joe, it was a fantastic experience for me because he's been a hero of mine for more than a decade now, and somebody who I consider to be beyond reproach, really, in the landscape world. And I actually work on the landscape assessment panel now, and Joe chaired that last year. He's now just on the panel with me, which is weird, sort of being shoulder to shoulder with him. But of course, he's a very humble man, so there's no awkwardness there. And I feel like he's my friend now, which meant that when I published the book and felt horrendously insecure, he got the first copy so that he could reassure me, because despite having a confident shell, I'm not always so confident in what I produce when it comes down to the brass tacks of things. And as to what I learned, Joe is the hardest working photographer I have ever met, bar none, and by some considerable distance. And I think the biggest thing that I learned from him is his willingness to fail with the camera. He takes a lot of images that I don't think are good at all, and he finds interest in them in his own way, and he very much pursues his own images and his own interests, and as a result creates images that I think nobody in the UK is currently capable of producing. And it's interesting to me that photography has never been easier, and yet there is nobody who holds a candle to Joe, in my opinion, still.
So, yeah. Interesting, Gary Player, the famous golfer, he once said that the more he practiced, the better he got, or the more he practiced, the luckier he got, is what he actually said. So it's a similar thing. Humble man, huge work ethic, fantastic.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Adam's asking what's next. I mean, apart from a baby, I mean, is there more photography in the pipeline? Or
yeah, that's the Adam Gibbs, I believe, another famous photographer. Yeah, so the next project will be Torridon. I'm actually going to work back through the last book effectively as separate books. I've already picked out the book cloth for the next book and the cover design. So Torridon will be the next, and I will aim to do it as extensively as I did Fisherfield. I've come to realize that other people can judge my photography as good or bad, and that's their prerogative. I know there are certainly better photographers than me, but the one thing I do have control of is how hard I can work and how dedicated I can be in my approach. And I've realized that very few people are willing to put that level of work in, which actually creates some potential for me to produce work that others can't. So that's why I'll be retreading my steps, and it's actually a process that I really enjoy.
And Jean, Jean Robson just recently got an F from the landscape panel, so that was a nice wee Scottish one there. She's saying you haven't mentioned much about text. Has the book got a lot of text in it?
It does, yeah. So some of the adventures that I've talked to you about are detailed in the book. Mm-hmm. I also introduced the areas, so that there's some understanding of the sort of photographic potential there and how I think of those areas. And Joe wrote a rather lovely forward too. So yeah, there's probably more text than people will expect, because I wanted to tell that tale of the adventure alongside the photographs themselves.
Yeah, and then Steve, I guess it's maybe one of the two Steves, he was saying, how do you visualize it? How do you pre-plan? Do you use Google Earth a lot, or do you do it from old photographs that you've taken and scouting trips you've made?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of mentioned this in the introduction to the book actually, but there's the book photos really are just a combination of two approaches. Some of them are very, very carefully planned, and they might be planned with views from Google Earth, or I'll look for other hikers images on something like Walk Highlands or something like that to give me a sense of a location if I've never been there before, you know, if it's somewhere really off track. And then I can think about my compositions before I've ever even arrived at a location, and use a tool called the photographer's ephemeris 3D, which will actually give you an impression of how the light will fall at certain times of the year. And so I can have a really specific understanding of what I'm aiming for in some cases. And then I go out to try and deliver upon that promise. But then there's a lot of images that are just pure chance, really, scenes that I come across and respond to. So it's a combination of those two approaches, really.
And Rowan was asking, what would you feel was your most difficult photograph to take, the most difficult image you managed to capture, either because of conditions or because of the walk? Or
yeah, I mean, I think I've kind of answered that question already. The view from a evasion in the snow, I mean, that really was next level difficult in terms of the hiking. Certainly there were some scenes that I never captured because I tried again and again and again, and I just wasn't successful. So I suppose you could argue that those were harder still, but others came very easily. And I think you might look at these images and think that I went up every mountain a dozen times. Some I just went up once. And, you know, you plan your ascent for when you think the light might be good, and then you adapt to what the light that's delivered. So not every image in this book was hard to capture, although I suppose almost everyone involved a long hike.
Is there a cut-off date for Christmas delivery for the book?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be Royal Mail cut-offs, but yeah, around the 17th for the UK. I think it's more like the 12th for international orders, but I am shipping out orders to time now. In fact, there's 60 books going out tomorrow, and then I'm completely up to speed, which is a nice position to be in, because I'm sick of everything related to packaging books already, I have to say. And yeah, I've got a lot more of it to do. I've only just passed the break-even point, so I could really do with making a few more sales.
Well, Keith was asking, how many books did you have printed?
1,700.
1,700.
Yeah, which is, you know, 2.5 metric tons, which will fill my small converted bungalow and make it for a very unhappy wife. But yeah, I'll palm some off onto friends to store for me, I think. But yeah, it's unfortunately, book printing costs have gone up and up and up. And so you always have to print larger numbers now, otherwise there's not a business there at all. Yeah, it's a difficult world actually, but you know, it's a natural end point for my photography.
Two much easier questions to end with, I think. You mentioned the coffee and the old butchers. Have you tried the gingerbread latte? I mean, they're really tasty.
Anybody who likes gingerbread latte cannot be my friend, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an awful drink.
Well, it's a really
sugary
sweet one.
and oh
it's a
dear,
really sweet one, but it's one of the best ones I've tasted.
oh.
Your mug there, is that a board pottery mug from Lewis?
It's not actually. It's from down here, but yeah, that's well,
very
it's in front of me now. Yeah, my tea mug. Unfortunately I broke my favorite mug, so I bought this one recently, but it's yeah, I quite like it.
Okay, well, I think we've exhausted all the questions and exhausted our eyeballs with the images you've put together. It's an epic looking book. It's a huge project undertaken in Scotland, and a great advert for Scotland and Scotland's landscape, and a fantastic advert for yourself. It really is quite stunning. Yeah, and people go to the website, get the book, make his house a wee bit less busy.
Yeah, and one last thing I will say, guys, is that you know, when I have the book shared by people online and mentioned to friends, it does make a huge difference to me when I make those sales, because there are very few people now in the UK able to make a living as landscape photographers. It's difficult. even as somebody who, you know, very fortunately has had, you know, 80 people turn up this evening. So I really do appreciate the support that I've had.
Well, I can say it's an epic looking book, and £49 seems a bargain when you think about your poor wee legs must have went through to get up and down some of those hills. So I was speaking to one of the other photographers tonight, and we were saying, imagine hiking up 45-degree climbs. And I said, he's young, you'll learn. Because your knees will not thank you in 25, 30 years time.
So they say. I'm tall too, so I've got it all running against me, but there you go.
So I'd like to thank everybody for coming up tonight and listening to what was a fantastic presentation. I'd like to thank the Landscape Group for helping put this on with us as well. And we're going to get a wee plug of our own in for PhotoFest 24. So if you haven't heard of it, you can go to Boleto or go to our webpage on the RPS Scotland webpage. It's a 2-day conference. I suppose it's biased towards landscapey stuff. We have Colin Pryor leading us off on the Saturday and Mick Durham leading us off on the Sunday. But fantastic speakers, distinctions, travelling exhibitions getting chosen. It's at Stirling University, which is a lovely central location. There's bed and breakfast available. It's a great value weekend for what we've got coming. So I would hope that as you're all rushing to buy Alec's book, after you've clicked on the website for his book, you would go back to our website and click on the website for PhotoFest 24. Thank you very much. And thank you very much again, Alec.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for hosting me, and thank you everybody for turning up. I'm very flattered that you're willing to listen to me for, you know, going on for 2 hours. Yeah, thanks very much.
Worth every minute of the 2 hours, Alex. It was a fantastic talk. So thanks once again on behalf of RPS Scotland. And I know Colin, the chair, and for our RPS landscape group is here as well. And I know he's had a fantastic night as well. So thanks again from ourselves. And we'll wish everyone a good night, and we'll stop the recording.